Welcome back to Fresh Outlook. I'm your host, Francesca Maxime. We continue to look at the history of gun control, different laws in this country, mental illness, how it may contribute to these kinds of shootings, all in the wake of the Newtown, Connecticut shooting yesterday that killed 20 children at a Connecticut elementary school. We have some tape now about the history of mental illness and how it may connect to gun violence in this country.
These are children, so that if you really want to make a statement, if you want to inflict damage on the community, if you want to really make an impression and get people really hurt, then you kill children, because you're attacking what is most precious in society, children, and therefore you make a big impact, a big splash in the community.
To make the biggest impact.
All right, well, what are your thoughts on what he had to say?
Well, I think, we spend a lot of time, and people will spend a lot of time trying to diagnose the mental challenges or mental disorder of the shooter, and I think that might be misdirected energy in some ways, because at the end of the day, there are a couple things. One, when you look at how we perceived Columbine in the immediate aftermath of it, that these guys were loners, that they were bullied, and all this that stuff ended up not really being true. That was not the facts of that situation, and so we should be very, very careful about trying to diagnose this guy in the media. Even his brother saying he had a personality disorder, such a wide range of different mental health issues. What we need to start to do again is, what's the sustainable conversation that we need to have around mental health? And the bottom line is, there's too much stigma around mental health. It's pretty clear right now that his mom had to have been aware of some of the challenges living with this young man that he had. But what were her options for reaching out, for getting help? What were our sort of community resources for her to be able to tap into to say, hey, my son is having some problems? There's too much stigma, not enough resource support to address issues around mental health. And so we should be thinking about that instead of trying to sort of rush to judgment, because we're gonna find out all the facts of this. It's just not going to happen immediately.
And tagging along, we should not be vilifying people with mental illness, because then a lot of people would think if you have mental illness, you're crazy. You might at any time go gun ho on other people.
Right.
But really, it's only a very, very small percentage of people who have mental illness who commit these kind of crimes, somewhere between 1% to 2%. So you're right, we can't stigmatize and demonize them, but we got to have a conversation about not stigmatizing mental health issues, so that people feel more comfortable asking for help, getting the help that they need. And really, we have to understand somewhere between 25–30% of Americans have mental health issues.
So much of this can actually take place within the context of schools, because school administrators, teachers spend more time with children than parents do. And they have multiple opportunities throughout the day, throughout the week, throughout the year to observe and to help. And I think that we have to really put more resources in that direction as well.
Is it possible, do you think, that schools coming out of this shooting, will become overly extreme in their security measures, that they will clamp down too much and make it more of a prison-like environment as opposed to a learning environment?
That's always the challenge, right? I mean, obviously we've been having these kinds of violent shootings happening in different kinds of ways in inner cities for a long, long time, and that's where you get the sort of the metal detectors and things in schools. That changes the environment of what a school is. You start to have police guarding there, you have metal detectors and different, so-called safety policies. It actually changes the environment of the school, and so we might need to do some of those things in the short term, but again, there's got to be a longer term effort geared towards addressing the culture of violence in our society, addressing the proliferation of guns, addressing the gun control laws and enforcement of those laws, wrestling with the stigmatization around mental health issues. There is a lot to do around this, and then so many things have happened recently, enough things have happened recently that hopefully we'll have the collective political will to address all these issues.
All right, well, how do you think the schools and the prison system and incarceration, how does this all fit together? Let's take a look at this.
Federal civil rights lawyers filed suit this year against Meridian, Mississippi and other defendants for operating what the government calls a school-to-prison pipeline, in which students are denied basic constitutional rights, sent to court, and incarcerated for minor school infractions. In many cases, the jailable offenses were as little as dress code violations or talking back to teachers, minor infractions that are disciplinary problems, not actual crimes. And it's not just Mississippi. School systems all over the country are being asked to reconsider harsh, zero-tolerance discipline programs. Critics say the tough policies are simply the wrong approach and target the most vulnerable students.
What we've turned the schools into is basically extensions of the police force, and they're not really schools anymore. They're starting to resemble more and more like prison-like complexes.
You know, and obviously there's going to be a lot of debate over whether or not that is happening more in an urban environment or in a suburban environment. And James, you know, you have a lot of insight in terms of the differences between urban and suburban communities.
Well, I've worked a lot on the school-to-prison pipeline, which is the data that Marian Wright Edelman started to sort of do research to figure out what was happening with children in inner-city schools and poorer schools in terms of how they were not getting tracked for education, but getting tracked for the prison industrial complex and the privatization of prisons. It seems unrelated, but actually it is related to things that we're talking about, because as WJ was talking about earlier, when we think about what we have to do in response to this, we have to be a lot more nuanced than just putting up metal detectors and trying to be more secure. We don't want to live in a police state. That doesn't make us any safer. Again, we've got to think about the things that are longer haul, more difficult things to think about, things that have to do with mental health, things that have to do with addressing the culture of violence.
And more preventive.
And more preventative, exactly. I don't want to like start censoring video games and music, things of those nature, but we've got to start to have the kind of conversations with young people that make them critical, sort of critically literate about the kind of media they're consuming. So you have young men, and I would bet dollars to donuts that all these young men that are going to movie theaters and shooting, they play video games.
Right, I was just about to say, so you don't think that it's worth censoring them at all? You don't think that we need any kind of censorship of video games or anything?
It doesn't work.
We don't need
censorship actually, when you make things more taboo for young people, they're going to go through more to try to get them. What we have to do is make them media literate, so that when they're playing Call of Duty, they've got to understand how to
see the difference.
Exactly, and we're not doing enough in the classrooms. And this is another point you made earlier too, about this work that we have to do in school systems to address some of these issues.
Can I,
Go ahead.
Can I just say something about the school prison pipeline, just to break it down a little bit so we understand better? Are you saying that, let's say, if I get caught up in the school to prison pipeline, I'm doing small petty crimes, or I'm talking back to my teacher, and all of a sudden I'm criminalized. Then what happens is slowly I might self-project myself as a criminal, and it becomes easier for me to see myself as a criminal and act as a hard-earned criminal. So, you know, that's what the prison industrial complex does also.
It's also about how we're allocating our resources in our society. And so when you look at some of the communities that are most sort of gripped by the school to prison pipeline, what you see is they're investing more in prisons in those states and in those municipalities than they are in the public education system. On top of all the expenditure we do already in the prisons.
Yes. You know. Right. Yeah. And I think that that's something that we have seen, the emergence of the private sector prison building industry, and we have seen that the majority of people, I mean, for example, you talked earlier, James, about the fact that you can't, the background checks need to be enhanced for people who are trying to access firearms. And I heard that, you know, there's a mandatory 5-year federal prison sentence if you lie on a background check when you are trying to access and obtain a weapon, but that those aren't prosecuted. So why is that the case when you have kids that perhaps are, you know, doing some small recreational drug use? They're the ones that are getting into that prison pipeline.
Again, this is where the NRA could step up, because the NRA could step up a lot on enforcement of existing gun control laws. This is the time for them to do that. Again, they're silent on that even right now. And when you start to talk about how do we police and engage children, again, we need a very comprehensive look at how we're raising, cultivating, and socializing young people. It's not just video games, we have to factor that in. It's not just violent films, we have to factor in. It's TV, you know, it's education system, it's how we respond to them in petty crime. I mean, there are a range of issues that we have to deal with.
Well, WJ, you were saying earlier, for example, that, you know, perhaps better centering, better spirituality, a better sense of perhaps morality.
The value of
human life and humanity.
So how does a parent teach that to their kids if they're sort of...
I think it's pandemic. I think when you consider actually the amount of time that we spend communicating with one another on electronic systems, never face-to-face anymore. This is actually, we're not talking to people on phones, we're talking to electronic devices. So we're not doing that, we're not connecting humanely with one another in ways that's going to actually develop our empathy and our protection of other human beings. I want to actually say a little bit about video games. The kill rate of people who engage in these kinds of crimes is extraordinary. But in terms of, can you outlaw video games? I know I'm changing gears a bit here. One of my students actually in school for her senior thesis is trying to find ways of injecting learning, even humane learning, into games that could be seen, in other words, moral lessons into even shooting games, to somehow actually be able to inject some
Humanize
of that
them
learning
a little
to
bit.
sensitize us and children more humanely, even in the process of engaging in those games.
Sure.
I think it can be done. It's worth a try.
Yeah, it's definitely worth a try because we know so many kids do watch them. We're going to need to take a break right now on Fresh Outlook, but when we come back, we will continue to discuss the Newtown massacre yesterday. We'll be right back.